think I'm live anyway. Kind of with the riots and all, it was, first of all, I hope you can hear me, but with the riots that was happening up the north, it was kind of like, you'd be chatting people, and, kind of true, I suppose, with partition for 100 years, like, it's the north kind of has diverged so far that it's kind of hard to kind of keep a tab on, what's happening up there. And I was just kind of thinking I might run through it, kind of how the northern mindset, as far as I can see, like, I'm on the border, so I kind of was raised on both sides of it. So, I was kind of thinking, like, where's a good place to start? And I, started with, it's like, you could start from the Good Friday Agreement and kind of work, kind of the last, 20 years, and try and piece together the idea from there. And I thought that you can't really leave out the Troubles. And then I was like, well, you kind of have to go back to partition then. So, and then you kind of start talking about partition. And then it's like, you kind of need to know what the Irish Parliamentary Party is to understand any of that, on the northern side. And then it's kind of like, I just wound up back in like the 9 Years' War up in like 1600. So I figured that was the kind of logical place to start anyway. So, the 9 Years' War, England had kind of expanded, and gained loyalty from different Gaelic tribes around the country at this stage. But it was still very staunch Gaelic land in the northwest, particularly. You had the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, and the Maguires of Fermanagh, and they kind of led the rebellion. And kind of unified the Gaelic tribes one last time to get rid of Henry VIII's forces in the country. Of course, that ended up in kind of disaster in Kinsale in 1601, whenever the Spanish basically were coming to our aid finally, so that we could, they could use here as a base to attack England. But the problem was that I'll start with where the O'Neills and the O'Donnells were at the time. They were in summertime 1601. They were in Donegal or Tyrone, up around that part of the country, and they were under attack too. The monastery in Donegal town, it was being used as a gunpowder store, guarded by British troops who parked a ship in the bay. And the O'Neills and the O'Donnells were kind of howling off and going to Kinsale the whole time. They were like, do we go, or do we stay and consolidate here? Or they kind of hemmed and hawed for a long time. Good evening, everyone. I just noticed the messages there, but they hemmed and hawed for a long time before deciding to go to Kinsale. And they actually had a falling out, O'Neill and O'Donnell, in Donegal town, because one wanted to stay. They'd actually managed to blow up the gunpowder store. That's how the Abbey in Donegal town got destroyed. And O'Donnell wanted to go in and root out all the soldiers. And O'Neill was like, no, like, if we've decided we're going to Kinsale, let's just stop wasting time, let's go. And they were bickering anyway. But O'Neill anyway decided, right, we're going to Kinsale, that's the end of it. He marched off anyway without O'Donnell, and O'Donnell kind of gave up after a while because, it was kind of too difficult to take on his own to get rid of, to eradicate the soldiers. And he started following O'Neill down to Kinsale. Now, while they were travelling to Kinsale, the British soldiers in Donegal town, they actually moved down towards Ballyshannon and took Ballyshannon as one of their towns. It was Ballyshannon is important, and Balleek beside it, just across the border, because that little stretch is the only way you can get from Donegal into the south without going through the north. And it was always a very important crossing site. Like Balleek is the flagstones or the crossing stones, across the river, because the next place is Enniskillen that you can cross, and that's ages away. And Ballyshannon, back in those days, it wasn't just like a canal that was dug out in the 40s to put an electric the ESB down there, but it used to be like cataracts, like a big giant wide waterfall, like salmon everywhere. You have probably heard of Ballyshannon and salmon. And anyways, then they went down to Kinsale, and that was a disaster. And the Spanish were basically told, right, if you leave now, we'll let you live, So they all packed up on their ships just before reinforcements had arrived. They met them at sea or whatever, and everyone turned around and went home. So O'Neill went back to Tyrone, and O'Donnell to Donegal, and a few stayed on in Castletown Bear, the Donald Cam O'Sullivan Bear. He kept fighting for, I think, another couple of months, and his whole cattle and all was stolen, raided by the Brits, and basically him and 1,000 of his last followers tried to make it to Leitrim. That was the March of Donald Cam O'Sullivan Bear, and by the time they got to Leitrim, there was only about, I think, 32 or something left alive, and that was the end of the Gaelic kingdoms. Had all collapsed, like all of them had folded to the British. But in 1603, O'Neill officially surrendered to Queen Elizabeth. But the problem was that Queen Elizabeth was after dying a couple of days beforehand, but he didn't know that. So he had surrendered, but he was re-granted. King James I came after him, or her, sorry, Queen Elizabeth. Then it was King James I. King James I done that, surrender and re-grant, so that O'Neill and all became earls, Earl of Tyrone. But in 1607, O'Neill realised that he wasn't this powerful Gaelic lord anymore, that his family had been, High Kings of Ireland for 600 odd years continuously. But, well, in theory anyway, maybe not officially, but so him and his family, including a fella called Owen O'Neill, his nephew, went to Rathmullen in September 1607, and they sailed to Spain, and he never returned, the Earl of Tyrone. And basically there was King James then decided that this was the civilise the Irish stage of history, where you have people dying of famine. There was a massive famine going through the country at the time. The plague was hitting us, and there was what you call the Lord Deputy of Ireland. His secretary recorded, that it was just like bodies lying in ditches. It was the same as the famine. Black 47, all that crack. People eating grass on the side of the road, lying dead. And this was when the English decided, right, we're going to plant the place with civilized people. And part of that plan was that they were going to build a defensive network of towns. So you had places like, there's a wee village called Coolmore and all. But it was basically the plantation of Ulster. It would make, I always thought growing up that it was Down and Antrim and them places, but that wasn't actually the British Crown that planted them. That was private businesses that planted them with Scots. That was like a non-government organisation, But it was like Donegal, Fermanagh, Tyrone, Derry, the Cavan, the areas that the O'Neills and the Maguires and the O'Donnells that they were in charge of, they had left. And one of these towns that they built as a kind of a fortress, they built massive walls around Derry. It was a town at the time. But it was that if there was ever any trouble, that the Protestants or the planters would be able to go into this city and have refuge in there. And in England at this time there was a lot of problems as well. They had a civil war, which coincided with the Irish Confederacy, Catholic Confederacy of Ireland, in about 1640, about that. And this was the parliamentarians versus the royalists in England. People saying that the king should have less power. Other people saying, that the divine rule of kings and all that kind of crack. And at the end of that civil war, that's when Cromwell arrived in the country. And rather than just planting Ulster, it was to hell or the Connacht. All the Irish get into Connacht or go to hell, And I kind of don't really need to go into Cromwell that much, I think, but his rule led to far stricter penal laws. Like the penal laws didn't all come in at the one time. They were built up, kind of like these COVID restrictions that you have, that on a restriction here and a restriction there. But like in Cromwell's time, that's when Catholics were banned from living in towns, and they couldn't travel more than five miles from their house or anything like that. So anyways, these anti-Catholic laws were severe, extremely severe, and the throne of England in the 1680s went to a guy called King James. Am I right here? Yeah, King James. He was a Catholic, and he started to try and repeal some of these anti-Catholic laws. And the English didn't like that at all. Like, they were kind of like, oh, this is an attack. We don't want, the popery and all this kind of stuff in the country. So they, and like a load of English nobles and Anglican bishops and all this, sent a letter to King James's son-in-law, who was William of Orange, King of the Netherlands, or whatever it was called, Holland back then, asking them, will you come and invade the country? And there was a lot of like politics going on at the time, and back and forths and discussions and all that kind of crack. But eventually he decided, in I think 1888, he was like, he landed in England with his army, massive army. And King James just fled, like he left for France straight away. And he started immediately trying to raise an army to retake England. Like King James was cocky. Like he thought, oh no, nobody's going to want to get rid of me. Like he was completely deluding himself. Like William of Orange started sending letters to like different Scottish clans, going, oh, we'll be good to you and all. Like we'll look after you. And King James just was like, you are my subject. You must follow my command and all this kind of crack. So the Scots were kind of like, oh no, screw him. We go with William of Orange. So anyways, whenever King James had kind of built up an army in France, it sailed and it landed in Cork, and it marched up through the country. And at one point, it was besieging the city of Derry, but it wasn't planning on besieging it. What it was planning on doing was just walking in the front gate and saying, King James is the king, so tough titties, like. But what happened was that during the plantation, what they used to do was they used to ship over like orphans and destitute children to plant the place, like to work as like fishermen's helpers and all this kind of crack, like they were called apprentice boys. So anyways, King James's army was heading towards the gates of Derry, and the leaders of Derry, like the town council or whatever, were like, yeah, look, we'll let him in, sure, why not? But these young fellas grabbed the keys of the city and they locked the gate, the main gate into Derry City. Then, basically then, that's when the siege of Derry began. This is whenever you hear Orange men and all Unionists shouting no surrender. That's where that comes from, was the siege of Derry. And whenever it was being besieged, it was 100 odd days. It was under siege during the winter. And because there was, obviously an invasionary force of Catholics entering the country, Protestants from all around the north, like all around kind of West Ulster, had all piled into Derry. So it went from like a population of a couple of thousand people up to like 30 or 40,000 people. So there was very little supplies for these people or anything like that. And the Jacobite army, they barricaded the river Foyle, by laying like big fucking ESB poles across the river and tying them together so that the ships couldn't get in and out with like reinforcements or supplies or anything like that. But what happened was that 4 boats were sent and they rammed after about 100 days, they rammed the river blockage and they bust through. And the Jacobites were like, all right, that's us fucked, like we'll just head home. So they like marched off somewhere else to go fight somewhere. And the Derry people were all like, all the Protestants inside were like, celebrating and all. And that's like, it's a major thing in Derry till today. Like, obviously with like no surrender and all that crack, but there's marches, Orange Man marches and all up there to commemorate that. But anyways, King James lost overall, and William of Orange took control of England. Him and his wife, technically, like, because King James or King Billy wasn't actually like a hereditary. I don't know what the term is, but he wasn't technically allowed to become King of England through his lineage. His wife was actually meant to be the Queen, but he wanted to be the King, if you get me. Not like, like Prince Philip today. Well, yes, or a couple of weeks ago, like that. Like he was the Queen's husband, kind of thing. But it was the same with William of Orange, but he like started changing all these laws, and he started putting in like more kind of pro-Anglican laws, like, which just locked in. It wasn't just anti-Catholic laws at this stage; it was pro-Protestant laws, and this led to what was called in our history anyway, the Protestant ascendancy. Whenever this is like from as far as I can tell, when modern Irish history, like, this is when people start thinking of it, like, is whenever the prods was on top, like all the Unionists was on top, which they were, like, and this is whenever like you started Catholics basically had nothing at this stage. Like, all our land had been confiscated. It was the landlord system had come into existence. Like, no Catholic owned feck all. Like, a Protestant at this stage was able to say, I want your house, and just take the house. Like, that was the law. Like, it's unbelievable today. Like, but it was, all you had to do was say, I'm Protestant, you're a Catholic, and I want this land, and legally it was yours. Like, Catholics couldn't own, a horse. If a Protestant wanted to buy a horse off him, he could say any price, like, for free, basically, and then just go, right, good luck, like, I bought this off you, whether you like it or not. And that's the way the rules were, like, in the country. Like, it was pure Unionists on top, everyone else, like, even Presbyterians at this stage were fucking muck, as far as they could see. It's all Anglican church. And this is whenever you started getting like real kind of agrarian violence. Like, it wasn't like, standing armies at this stage, because we were completely fucking devastated as a country. Like, and like, this is like, this term came up now recently, is the white boys. That's when these fellas came around. White boyism, which was basically like gangs of young lads or men going out at night and just kicking the shit out of farmers, like dragging them out of their houses and burning them, like, burning the houses down and all. That's what all the Irish could do. Like, we couldn't raise an army, we had no weapons. It was just bucks with sticks going in, just kicking the crap out of Protestants. Like, that was big. That went on. Like, we had no real organisation, like, from 1700 up until 1798, and like, then it was the young wolf toe and all. Like, we had to rely on the French at that stage. That's when you start getting all this, we should declare a republic instead, get rid of the monarchs altogether. Like, that was our solution. Whereas our previous solution was, no, we should put a friendly king on the throne. So anyways, at this stage, Ireland was technically a separate kingdom. The United Kingdom didn't exist at this stage. But you had like the Act of Union in 1801 or something. It made Ireland, it was the United Kingdom of Scotland, England, and Ireland, or whatever, So that was like, we were one country at that stage with the UK, rather than just a separate kingdom ruled by the same ruler as the UK. Like, so we were kind of getting our arses handed to us for a long time, but we had like secret organizations. Like, there was one like the Ribbon Men and the Defenders, all these kind of ways. Some were more kind of business orientated, and some were a mix of like business, like trying to eke out a living for Catholics, and others were just like, like kind of proto IRA type, squads. Used to just go around attacking people. Like, the white boys would have been more like just physical force, whereas like Ribbon Men used to be kind of like more kind of, let's set up this kind of community banking thing amongst the Catholics in the area, And the Presbyterians actually helped with that as well, like, because they were getting the raw deal as well. Like, they were getting treated nearly just as badly as the Catholics. So we're in the 1800s now at this stage, like, and this is whenever you get Daniel O'Connell coming in, the liberator. And he gained Catholic emancipation, which was a repeal of the penal laws. This was only like just before the famine happened, like, and then of course the famine happened. And like one thing about the famine was that while there was people emigrating left, right, and centre who could get out of the country, because there was emancipation, Catholics were allowed into the towns again to live in towns. So you had rural people starving to death, fleeing into like Dublin, Belfast, Cork, and Derry. So you ended up with like basically the whole of like nearly everyone in the Inishowen Peninsula, apart from like a few, flooding into Derry City to live there, like, you know. And this is where we're getting into modern times, if you get me, like, because that's a major thing now, like, because Derry has been a nationalist majority, you know, Catholic, whatever, majority town since then, like. So, what was I going to say? Yeah, like, we had no real kind of organisation, you know. We were completely bet back as a people. Like, I remember my mother, whenever she was young, like, her great granny used to be around at that time, and she used to talk about, like, you know, people that she knew from the famine and all, like, and what they were telling, like, you know, what, like, first hand, like, you know, second hand account of what was happening in the local area, like, you know, people finding dead people just lying out in roads and all this kind of crack, and you know, just general real bad, like, you know, people used to like wince. There was like this here, like, nobody talked about it, like, it was just the spirit was broken of people. And basically whenever you got the Catholic, after the Catholic emancipation, you had people like Isaac Butt and Charles Stewart Parnell and all these kind of boys starting things like the Land League. And that was to get back the land that had been confiscated from Catholics. And, you know, instead of having this landlord system, have you know, Catholics owning their own land and, you know, not paying fucking unionists to live. And that kind of it developed over time into the Irish Parliamentary Party. It was like, instead of just the land question, it became a home rule party. It became, you know, a party with policy in many areas, like, you know, an Irish nationalist party, for the lack of a better term, a very watery one, in fairness. Like, you know, it was like even Sinn Féin was the radicals in 1905 against the Irish Parliamentary Party, except, you know, Sinn Féin were still like a monarchist party, like they were going to, like, and they were the radicals. So you can imagine how watery this Irish Parliamentary Party was. But let me see now. The Parliamentary Party, they took their seats in Westminster. Obviously, like, they were in the House of Commons, and a few times, I think 2 or 3 times, from like 1880s up to like 1910, they had the balance of power in the House of Commons. So they started pushing for home rule for Ireland. And William Gladstone, however you pronounce it, was the Prime Minister, a Liberal Party Prime Minister in like the 1880s. And he wanted, you know, Irish Parliamentary Party support, so he agreed to put home rule to a vote. And it passed in 1886. But the problem was that the Unionists didn't like that, so they like nearly burnt down Belfast, you know, in riots to make sure that home rule didn't happen. So the Irish Parliamentary Party under Parnell, it had, you would have heard the name Kitty O'Shea, that he was having he was said to be having an affair or whatever. And there could have been a lot of propaganda kind of stuff going on at that stage, because they tried to nail the Irish Parliamentary Party, saying that they were organising a revolution and all this kind of crack, you know. But basically the Irish Parliamentary Party split into the Irish National League, which was the pro-Parnell, but they were only about a third of the members. And then there was the Irish National Federation, and they were like, you know, more pro-Catholic, you know, pro-church, you know, as opposed to Parnell, who was seen as a kind of a, like a womanizer or whatever. And they had about 2/3 of the support. But it was in complete disarray, like, things was not going well at all. Like, but this here fella in Mayo started a group called the United Ireland League. And his plan was that he would try and force a merger again between the Irish Party, like, of what constituted the Irish Parliamentary Party, to force them back into one party so that they could have, power in the House of Commons again. And he succeeded. In around 1900, the Irish Parliamentary Party came back together as one unit, and they ended up with the balance of power again in the House of Commons. And what they did then was that they sorted the land question, which was that farmers, Catholic farmers, would be able to buy back their farms for, below market value, and the government would subsidise, the British government would subsidise the Unionists for selling. So everyone was mad. Like, all the Catholics were mad to buy land. All Unionists were fucking mad to sell because they were getting way more than they would otherwise. And that was in 1903 that happened. In 1905, Sinn Féin was founded. And the land question had a lot to do with that. Like, a lot of people were upset when the land question was settled because they seen that as a setback to having an independent country or a home rule parliament, that it would placate a lot of people into, not acting up. And that's why Sinn Féin came about. They were an all-Ireland home rule party. And Sinn Féin ran in their first election in 1908, and the Irish Parliamentary Party got 80% of the vote, like 82% of the vote or something like that, and Sinn Féin got like 18%. And Sinn Féin kind of faded away after that. Their Ardèche, I think, was in double digits in like 1910. Like, they did nobody. And then, of course, there was another home rule bill in, I think, 1910 it was proposed, and it passed the House of Commons in 1913. And in the meantime, the British had changed the law that the House of Lords wouldn't be able to veto legislation, because that's what happened to the previous home rule bills. If it passed in the House of Commons, the Lords would just go no. So they changed the law. They managed to force it in like 1910 or whatever, during 1908, and in around that period, that the House of Lords wasn't able to veto everything. And that's whenever like the kind of bare bones welfare state started in Britain. Like old age pension and stuff like that came in. And it was it kind of like, it got to 1913, and it looked like home rule was going to be granted. And there was this here guy, he was a unionist MP from Dublin called Edward Carson. And Edward Carson came up with this here document called the Ulster Covenant. And it was signed all in all by 500,000 people. To you, that it was a proclamation, like what's the word? It was a declaration that anyone that signs this document will use any means necessary to stop a home rule parliament. And that happened in 1913. In January 1914, a group called the Ulster Volunteer Force was established, the UVF, and they were an army of 100,000 men who had imported arms, who were saying that they were going to fight physically to stop home rule being enacted. So what the Irish Nationalists did was they set up their own volunteers, the Irish Volunteers, and had 180,000 members apparently. So what kind of threw a spanner in the works then was home rule that had passed in the House of Parliament. It was put on hold because World War I broke out. And the Irish Parliamentary Party, because they were kind of propping up the government, they were like, right, we'll support the war. And a lot of the Irish volunteers went with the Irish Parliamentary Party side of things, and they became the National Volunteers. And the Irish volunteers were like, no, we're not supporting any British war or whatever. And that was like nearly the death knell of the Irish Parliamentary Party, because even though 80% of the Irish volunteers had went with them, not that many actually like joined up to fight or anything like that. Nobody was really, for it. And then all of a sudden, then of course you have this group, the IRB, decided, right, we've had enough of this, lads, and they marched to Dublin on Easter 1916. And now we're kind of into a stage, where most people kind of know what happened, at certain stages. But I'm just going to go through a few wee things that happened that after, I'll say, like, during the War of Independence, right? We'll pick it up here. That whenever the War of Independence was going on, it was the people in the south of the country that was majority. Like, you have the Cork, the Tom Barrys of the situation, like, all these boys that are kind of, they're on home turf, like, they've got the support of the local people and all, and they were kind of like, we're gonna keep fighting, and the fellas in the north who were, living in unionist areas and all, they were more pro-treaty than people in the south, which I thought was a bit oxymoronic, like. And whenever it came to the treaty, it was the Free State that was accepted, was supposed to be like a launching pad to take over the north. That's what Collins was thinking of. And the idea of like pro-treaty and anti-treaty, it didn't really have an effect nearly up until the very start of the Civil War. Like, the IRA and the National Army were still working together outside of Dublin. Like, it was a kind of like an ideological thing, this pro-anti-treaty, for a lot of it, for a lot of time. Like, the largest military engagement in Ireland since 1916 was the Battle of Pedigo, and that happened in, I think, 1921. It happened like it was like 2 weeks before, or like a month before the shelling of the Four Courts when the Civil War began. But the Irish National Army was handed back bases, like forts and camps, army camps from the British Army, and one of them is a fort just overlooking the village of Balik in Fermanagh, right on the border between Ballyshannon and Balik. So the Irish Army were occupying that. So what happened was the IRA from like Tyrone, all over the place, like, started assembling just outside Balik on the southern side, and together the Irish Army and the IRA started attacking the north. And at the same time, the Catholics that were trapped in Belfast and up around, I think Moira, is that the name of the area, up in the northeast of Northern Ireland, or the north, I should say. I guess I get given out there. But like, that's like the Free State Army had been shipping arms up there to try and get them, like, we'll get them fighting on two fronts, get the Unionists fighting on two fronts, and try and collapse this state before the the Boundary Commission is finished. Like, so, massive battle. A fantastic article on it, I think, on Shunnick Fun or something, one of them websites, Battle of Pedigo. It's really, really interesting. But this is where now North and South diverge, because the Northern Statelet had been established at this stage. It had, in I think July 1921, it had its first parliament. It was James Craig in charge of it, and he said, this is a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people. And it really was, like, because they enacted straight away a thing called the Special Powers Act, which was essentially like a wartime emergency act that wasn't repealed until like 1973, I think. And they also established, I should say, a group called the B Specials. The B Specials were quasi-paramilitary. They were technically they were a reserve for the RUC, which was the northern version of the RIC, the black and tans, like. But all it was I'll tell you how it started. During the Battle of Petago, there was a fella there called, I think his name was Cecil Brooke. He became known as Lord Brookborough, I think. But he was from Lisnaskea in Fermanagh. And he set up this group called Fermanagh Vigilance, which was a kind of a unionist paramilitary, or community watch, they'd probably call it. But to guard this town, Lisnaskea, from IRA attacks. And from that idea, the idea of the B Specials came around, which was a state-sanctioned paramilitary where anyone could join up. There was the A Specials, B Specials, and C Specials, but only the B Specials stuck around. The A Specials were like full-time, military kind of boys that used to lead the B Specials, and then the C Specials were like the reserve, basically every other man in Ulster or every other unionist in Ulster. But it was entirely Protestant, 100%. Catholics were not allowed to join that, whereas in the RUC, technically Catholics were allowed to join, but they didn't, like, obviously, because you'd be shot by your own family if you did that, like. Because it was, you'd be going against nationalism. You'd be going against, like, you would be selling out if you joined the RUC, like. So the B Specials were basically this little vigilante group all over the north, basically an IRA running the fucking country that answered to nobody, that was allowed to keep their weapons in their own home without anyone asking any questions, without any oversight whatsoever. And this is what Northern Ireland was for decades. Like, it's so hard to, like, for someone that never, like, seen British soldiers on the streets. Like, I only seen the end of the soldiers on the streets. Like, I was only a kid when the Good Friday Agreement came in. We'll get on to that, but just like I had family members that died along the border in, like, the 30s, from doing jobs and stuff like that for the nationalist side. And it's unbelievable. Like, you had internment both sides of the border. You had extrajudicial executions going on both sides of the border. It was absolutely mental. Like, it's hard to describe. How could you put it? It was like a genocide. It really, really was. It was an ethnic cleansing. All the while, streets were being burnt out around Belfast to get Catholics out of the area. Like, that, and Catholics were fighting back the odd time, but there was massive reprisals over that. So it kind of, like, got to a stage where the Unionists were on top. There was no denying it whatsoever, and Catholics were a second-class citizen. And you can, like, it was like, basically, like, nearly to a man, Catholics were all nationalists and Protestants were all unionists. Like, that was the dividing line. There was no kind of fudginess at all. Like, no fuzziness. It was, you're a Catholic, you're a nationalist, and it was like this mindset continued for, I can remember it. Growing up, it's what's your name, and then you tell them your name, and if it was a Protestant name, they'd know how to treat you. Or if it was a Protestant or a Catholic, they'd know how to act around you. Or if it was like a name that could be Catholic, could be Protestant, where are you from? And if you said, like, a nationalist area or a unionist area, they'd know how to treat you. And then if they still couldn't wig it, they'd go, what school did you go to? And this is, like, in the mindset of like, what tribe are you in, basically, is what they're asking you. And that's like a pure northern thing. Like, in the south, like, we'd ask, where are you from, or whatever. Like, it was that big hubbub. But you don't bother asking people, like, oh, did you go to the Holy Family School, did you, or did you go to, some fucking Protestant fucking thing, anyway. But yeah, the North was mental, and there's some great documentaries. Like, I was watching one, Radark, I think it was how you pronounce it, but it was Derry in 1964. You should watch that. Like that's how Seamus Heaney's father's actually interviewed in it. I'll go back to the Irish Parliamentary Party for a moment here now, at the foundation of the Northern Statelet. You have the Irish Parliamentary Party in 1921 changed its name in the North to the Nationalist Party, as opposed to the Unionist Party, who ruled Northern Ireland without a break from 1921 to 1973, I think. And they changed the name to the Nationalist Party, the Irish Parliamentary Party. And Sinn Féin ran in the election in 1921, and they had a voting pact with the Nationalist Party. But between them, they only won 12 seats out of, I think, 90. If I remember correctly, they only won 12 seats. But you had a guy called, what was his name? He was from Belfast. He was the leader of the Irish, as I mentioned, Joseph Devlin. He was from the Falls Road in Belfast. He was the guy that established the Ancient Order of Hibernians. But he became the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, led it until his death in the 30s sometime. But Sinn Féin were banned in the North, like as an entity. Like it was an imprisonable offence to be a member of Sinn Féin in the North, in like from like the enactment of the Special Powers Act until 1974. I think it was 1974 that was repealed. Like that is just crazy. Like and you had this like a boiling point. Like people were living in hovels in Derry, especially, because Derry had a strange situation because it was a nationalist majority area. So in 1921, the town council was a nationalist town council, and they were able to decide who gets houses. And the thing was that houses, they meant votes, and businesses meant votes. Like it wasn't. You often heard, you probably heard, one man, one vote. That's because in the North, if you had a business, the business got a vote, and you could only vote if you owned a house. So if the council isn't giving houses to Catholics and only giving them to Unionists, and as many as possible to Unionists, and setting up, giving them grants for businesses and all this, that's how they maintained their stranglehold for decades. Like even in places like Derry, that was 70% Catholic. And basically, then this group, I should probably go back and then talk about what the IRA was doing in this time. IRA in the 1920s, 1930s wasn't in good shape. It was down to not a whole lot of members. Like, it was kind of random bomb attacks, a couple of shootouts. It wasn't a big pie going on. In the 1940s, they had the S plan, the sabotage plan, and that was planting explosives around England and the North to try and force the British to listen to the demands for a united Ireland. And they were purely physical force. Like there was no politics about them. There was no Sinn Féin. There was no nothing. Sinn Féin at this stage had become Fianna Fáil essentially. And there was nobody, like Sinn Féin was defunct. It didn't exist in practicality. Like Sinn Féin was families at this stage. Like, it was just supporters of the IRA were Sinn Féin. Like you're kind of born into it rather than join the political party, So the S plan failed. And then they planned another campaign, the border campaign in the 50s, Operation Harvest, it was called. And that was a disaster too. I think that's when Sean South was killed and a lot of other boys, This was Rory O'Brady was the guy in charge of the IRA at this stage, in the late 50s. In 1947, that's when the IRA took over Sinn Féin. Like Sinn Féin was basically like just like a handful of people that used to like print leaflets and hand them out or whatever, and IRA were like, right, we're losing badly here now, like on the propaganda side of things, because they've been interned both sides of the border, like, in prison without trial by both the Free State and the Northern government. So they were like, we're going to have to get, our media game up a notch here. So they took over Sinn Féin, and one of these guys that kind of like led Sinn Féin, the IRA at the time, he was one of the three Macs, they're called. McCurtain and McCann, I think, and there's another one. But one of them had to sell his family farm, like everything he owned, to try and fund this newspaper, to get Sinn Féin to be the mouthpiece of the IRA. Like. And it ended up then that the border campaign was a total disaster. It ended up, they had a couple of good victories, like the raid on Gough Barracks. You should look that up. That's hilarious. They dressed up as British soldiers and just waltzed into the barracks and cleared every weapon out of it. Not a shot fired. Like, just walked in, walked out. But basically after the failure of Operation Harvest, the Sinn Féin at this stage was run by old school traditionalist Republicans. Like the old 1920s types, the boys that had fought in the War of Independence, like. But then you had younger fellas, and namely the likes of the commanding officer at the time was Rory O'Brady, and he suggested that instead of being just purely physical force Republicans, that they should adopt an ideological stance on economics. So they decided, Rory O'Brady decided on behalf of everyone else, that the IRA was going to shift to the left in order to kind of mirror socialist revolutions that was going on around the world at that time, Guevara and all that kind of stuff. And he managed to pressurize the old traditional leadership, and he took over. Rory O'Brady, from being leader of the IRA, took over Sinn Féin, and in his place in the IRA, he appointed Cathal Goulding. And Cathal Goulding was also a fucking unabashed socialist. And this was in 1962. So things kind of kept ticking along for a while, for the next year or two. And in 1964, 1965, you had a group called the Derry Housing Association or whatever. It was kind of like the precursor to the civil rights movement, and they were all socialists, like by and large, pretty much all of them. And it kind of morphed into over time this Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, and you had that's where like John Hume came out of, and all these different characters that play a real important role throughout history or Northern history, like. But they, I'm trying to think. Whereas the Troubles is a messed up situation, like it really is. Like, I'm not even going to go into reprisal attacks and collusion, like the Glenanne gang. You've probably seen that on Quiet Graves and all. It was a complete clusterfuck. Like it was terrible. I know people that was involved in it, and it was just fucking shocking. Like. But as you probably would imagine, but hearing it firsthand is kind of it's messed up. Like. But what was I going to say there? People say the Troubles began in 1968, 5th of October 1968, because there was a civil rights march going through Derry, but there was kind of heightened tension, like, because you have to understand the Unionists at this situation too. The Catholics are like, we want houses, like, we're not fucking putting up with this shit anymore. And then you had Unionists going, no, we're in charge, we're not being ruled by Catholics. You get like no surrender. That's the siege mentality lives on in their heads, like, and they would not accept any concessions at all to Catholics. So those riots, there was counter protests, there was, at one stage there was a peace march. I think it was going through, I can't remember where it was going through, but it was crossing a bridge, and the RUC came up and was like, to the civil rights marchers, they're like, lads, this is dangerous. Like, if you are going to have to follow us across the bridge, like, for your own safety. And there's like an angry mob up ahead, and the civil rights marchers kind of looked at each other and were like, right, fuck it, we've no real option. Like, and the RUC led them into an ambush with B specials. Like, you started pelting them with glass bottles and rocks, and that's the way the North was. Like, they enjoyed the shit out of that. Like, that was like, oh yeah, we got them kind of thing. It was a great joke. And anyways, in Derry, there was news cameras were recording this march. Just, they kind of got wind of it. And before the march started, there's videos of this online. Like, the police come out, the RUC come out, and they start, they read out, like, oh, this is a banned protest. You're only allowed to march in certain areas. If you travel through wherever, we will arrest you. And the march started anyway, and the next thing then, a couple of minutes later, cops just start walking through people and, like, just cracking their skulls open with batons, like, just baiting them, like, real bad. And this was shown on British television. And suddenly England realised, English people realised, holy shit, what the fuck is going on in this place? Like, and that led to, houses being burnt out in Belfast by unionists who did, get back in your place, you filthy Catholic, kind of thing, And it was fucking absolute disaster, pandemonium. And the next thing then, people were like, we need to defend our homes. Like, so we can't keep getting burnt out of our houses and getting walked over all the fucking time. And so what happened was a guy, Sean McStefan, who, a member of the ARA, him and Joe Cahill and a few other people gathered together and decided that they needed to bring the IRA away from this socialist civil rights bullshit and start fucking blowing stuff up. And I have to go through now another bit of a fucking situation south of the border that was happening at this time, right? I seen RTE done a thing about this not so long ago. It was the arms trial. The arms trial was a show trial, basically, from Jack Lynch to to make it kind of look like he was fucking doing something but not doing anything that the Brits didn't want him to do, and all this kind of bullshit. Like, but basically, the long and short of it is that the Irish government wanted the UN to go in, like same as the Lebanon day, like to go into the north, because the British troops were on the streets just in like 1969, I think, were put on the streets in the north. And Catholics at the time were like, thank fuck, like at least they're less, less biased than the big specials in the RUC, like. But that obviously changed pretty quickly, like, because they started fucking, shooting people randomly. 1973, it was Bloody Sunday, like, 13 people gunned down for no reason whatsoever. That's a pretty iconic moment, like. But yeah, south of the border, the Irish government had Neil Blaney, an army captain called John Kelly, and a few other fellas, Charlie Haughey, Minister for Finance at the time. They were told, they were given £100,000 in a bank account, and they were told that's a relief fund. And it was generally, like, everybody was aware the relief was weaponry. So the Irish government kind of turned a blind eye to whatever they were doing for a while, and they started trying to import arms into the north, as they were fucking ordered to, and or heavily leaned that kind of way, told kind of without saying so much as. But it got found out, like the Irish government had been trying to get a group of pro-Free State IRA types to set up a new version of the IRA, because they knew a split was coming, that people were like, we need fucking physical action, versus the leadership in Dublin going, Cathal Goulding going, oh, we can't, like, we're trying to win a propaganda war here, versus while people are getting burnt out of their homes, like. And the Irish government tried to steer that to, like, people like a guy called Paddy Bogside Doherty was one of like the people that they approached. He was trained by the Free State Army in Donegal, along with about 30 other people, that the Irish Army were like, right, these fellas are going to be like our guys in the north, like a militia, kind of like B specials, you know, just armed citizens. And at the same time, the Irish Army had shipped up a fucking load of guns to Dundalk. You know, all this was happening at the one time. Crazy times, like. And basically then anyway, the arms importation got found out by actually, I don't, it's kind of hard to answer that, like, because Dillon was the Minister for Defence at the time and he knew about it, and it was his secretary that fucking, you know, twisted the knife in Charlie Haughey. And that ended up in a big fucking disaster. But all this was released in the year 2000. Like, this happened in 1970, and under the 30-year rule then, all these files were released, and the government knew fucking everything that was going on. Like, and that was part of that. That was just after the Jack Lynch speech. You've often seen it, or you probably would have seen it before. We can no longer stand by. You probably remember that. But that's what people were like. People in Derry were screaming, like, literally to bring in the Irish Army. You know, they were like, please invade this fucking place and save us, like. Whereas the Irish government done fucking nothing. They had Operation Armageddon drawn up. They had the IRA were fucking resurging like fuck. They had support internationally, and then they fucking sat in their hands. Sorry for cursing there, like, but Jesus, anyways. In 1970 as well, you had a political party called the SDLP, Social Democratic and Labour Party, Socialist Party in Northern Ireland, basically. Finner Camp, Brian Brew. It was actually a good thing if you look at it. It's a PDF. It's will it be a pint or Ballyshannon? It's about the border in during the Troubles. It's a good read, like, a lot of this. It talks about Balik a lot, about Ballyshannon and Bundoran, you know, which were hotbeds for dissident Republicans. You know, there's a couple of Donegal county councillors, you know, they're only living in Donegal because they went on the run in the 70s and ended up in this area. But this kind of, it gets to the Troubles, and I don't really want to go over the fucking nitty gritty, because you probably know a good bit about, you know, who shot who and then what happened and all that kind of crack. And I'm at an hour nearly here now at the minute, so what I think I'm going to do is bust this into two parts, and I'm going to maybe do a quick rundown the next day for what happened between, like, you know, kind of a chronological 1969 to 1974 or whatever, and then start kind of building on that, you know, like up to like the Sunningdale Agreement, you know, the collapse of Stormont, the next like fucking 30 years of history up until the Good Friday Agreement, and then the Good Friday Agreement till today. I think that's the way I'm going to do it, because I've an hour here, and I've had a solid, you know, the number has been steady, so hopefully is liked a bit of it or whatever, and maybe learn something. But just to get into the mindset, like, of people under siege, you know, it's such an important aspect of Irish nationalism that just doesn't get enough attention down here, you know. And it's like a kind of it's nearly like a club, if you get me, like, you know, being involved in northern politics, like, you know, it's a very closed off kind of thing. Yeah, Jerry Fitt, Brian Brew, you're right there, Jerry Fitt. He was a socialist. He claimed to be a socialist. I don't even think. I doubt a lot of these socialist boys back in the 70s would be in full agreement with what is happening now. But yeah, there's a lot of them that are Marxist, lefty, you know, rainbow flag types now these days. But yeah, there was the I can go through in the next video the official provisional split and different things that happened in the meantime, and yeah, I think that'll work out all right. I'll flick down through the comments here. Eamon McCann, Bernadette Devlin. Yeah, fair play, Brian Brew. You've a load of stuff here. A lot of ugly. Sorry, I'm just clicking through here. The Civil War. The oath. Yeah. Right. Well, yeah, I'll go over the comments and sure if I missed anything, I'll clear it up in the next video. And thanks very much for listening. And I hope you have a good night. And hopefully the North doesn't go turn into an absolute hellscape again, which is a distinct possibility at the minute. Good night.